A determined nurse, a dangerous secret, and a life-changing act of courage. What happens when compassion collides with the shadows? Stay tuned to uncover the untold story. Paige was an experienced nurse practitioner and midwife who had spent years in high-stress emergency rooms. For her, nursing wasn't just a job, it was her calling. Despite the challenges, like the time a psychiatric patient attacked her, leaving a permanent scar, Paige remained dedicated, growing stronger after every struggle. Her life took a devastating turn when she lost her baby during labor, a tragedy that nearly claimed her own life. Months of physical and emotional recovery left her questioning everything she once believed in. The loss fractured her marriage, and eventually she and her husband amicably parted ways. Searching for peace, Paige left the chaos of the city and moved to Iron River, a quiet town surrounded by forests and rivers. There, she took a job assisting the town's aging doctor. The stillness of Iron River offered a chance to heal, though Paige wasn't sure if she could truly move on. Yet, in this small town, she began to see glimmers of hope, a place to leave her pain behind and rebuild her life. When Paige moved to Iron River, she received mixed reactions from the townspeople. While some welcomed her with open arms, others regarded the outsider from the city with suspicion. But Paige didn't pay much attention to these attitudes. She was focused on becoming part of the small town and helping its people. Iron Bar, the town's only bar, quickly became a significant part of Paige's life. It was not only a place where she could enjoy a decent meal but also a spot where she could get to know the locals better. Brad, the man in charge of the bar, was a former soldier with a tough yet fair demeanor. The bar was conveniently close to the cabin Paige had rented, which meant she and Brad often crossed paths. Brad was one of the first people Paige met in town. From their initial meeting, Brad sensed that there was something different about her. As their conversations deepened, he noticed how Paige hinted at aspects of her profession. Although she didn't explicitly share much, her passion for helping people and her disciplined attitude made Brad suspect that Paige, like him, had a difficult past. And in some ways he was right. Paige had faced many battles in her life and had been forced to rebuild herself time and time again. Paige's first major act of assistance in Iron River involved a local mother. The woman, who had survived a difficult childbirth, now had to be extra cautious with her diet due to a heart condition. To support her, Paige compiled a list of the special organic foods the mother needed. These items weren't available in the town, but about 70 kilometers away, there was a farm that sold them. Paige decided to make the trip to the farm to help the mother. When she shared her plan with Brad, he hesitated. "That road is a bit tricky and dangerous," he said, frowning. "It's not a good idea to go alone. I'll come with you." Brad had good reason for his concern. Due to its remote and isolated location, Iron River had caught the attention of illegal crop growers years ago. These individuals used the area's desolate land for secret production and eventually evolved into a more dangerous group. Now this group functioned like a gang, and the townspeople preferred to steer clear of them. Brad knew that Paige was unaware of this threat. While Brad didn't fully explain the danger to Paige, he wasn't about to let her go alone. "This trip might be tougher than you think," he added. "But if we go together, it'll be fine." From Brad's serious expression, Paige realized that this journey wasn't going to be an ordinary shopping trip. Still, she didn't back down. "All right," she said firmly. "But we have to help this mother." Brad respected her determination and nodded. "All right," he said. "We'll leave early in the morning." At the break of dawn, Brad pulled up in front of Paige's cabin with his truck. Hearing the low hum of the engine, Paige glanced out the window and took a deep breath. Despite the cold weather, she was ready, filled with a mix of excitement and a little apprehension. Brad opened the door and greeted her. "Ready?" he asked, attempting a smile. Paige returned a faint smile as she slung her bag over her shoulder. "Yes, I'm ready." Once she got into the truck, they set off. The roads were covered in snow, winding deeper into the forest. Along the way, Brad tried to ask questions to learn more about Paige's life. But Paige didn't seem quite ready to talk about her past. Noticing her distant demeanor, Brad decided not to push the subject further. Just then, a sudden noise echoed through the truck. The vehicle jolted, and Brad quickly brought it to a stop. "What happened?" Paige asked, her voice tinged with unease. "A flat tire," Brad muttered in frustration. He stepped out of the truck to check. What he saw darkened his expression even further. There was a thin but sturdy warning chain placed across the road. It was a message for any uninvited visitors. This was their territory. With a sigh, Brad moved to the back of the truck and began pulling out the spare tire and tools. Leaning into the truck, he called out to Paige, "Stay inside. No matter what, don't come out." But Brad's warning came too late. From the forest emerged two men, armed and menacing. Their expressions were cold and threatening. Brad took a deep breath, trying to appear as calm as possible. Slowly he raised his hands. Paige stepped out of the truck, raising her hands as well. The men's eyes scanned both Brad and Paige intently. "Where are you headed?" one of the men asked, his voice sharp and accusatory. Paige quickly answered, "We're going to the farm. To pick up supplies." "I'm a nurse. It's for a patient." The men exchanged glances before turning back to Paige. One of them squinted and asked, "Are you a doctor?" "No, I'm a nurse," Paige replied, her voice steady but firm. At that moment, one of the men reached out to grab Paige's arm. But Brad quickly stepped in, shoving the man back. The tension escalated instantly. The second man raised his weapon, aiming it directly at Brad in a threatening stance. Paige took a deep breath and asked calmly, "Why?" The men looked at each other for a brief moment before one of them spoke. "There's someone injured. You fix them and we'll let you go." Paige hesitated, a mix of shock and worry flashing across her face. After a moment she nodded. But she had one condition. "I'm not going without Brad," she said firmly. After a brief silence, the men agreed to her terms. They led both Paige and Brad into the depths of the forest. Paige couldn't believe how quickly she had found herself in such a dangerous situation. The snow-covered trees gave way to large greenhouses and a small, crowded settlement. Women, children, and armed men moved around quietly but purposefully. Inside the greenhouses, Paige saw the forbidden plants being cultivated, revealing the true purpose of this place. What she saw left her both stunned and uneasy. This wasn't just an illegal operation, it was an entirely isolated community. The innocence in the children's eyes, the exhaustion etched on the women's faces, and the hardened expressions of the men painted a picture of a place that was as dangerous as it was deeply affecting. Brad glanced at Paige and whispered under his breath, "Whatever you do, stay calm. It's the only way we'll make it out of here." Paige took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. Inside her, there was a clash of emotions, her dedication as a nurse to help others, and her growing curiosity about why these people were here. Now, in the midst of this unknown, she found herself unsure of what was to come. A man approached Paige hastily and said, "This way." Paige glanced at Brad briefly. Brad nodded and started walking ahead, but the man abruptly stopped and said firmly, "Just her," pointing at Brad. Brad locked eyes with the man. "That's not going to happen," he said with determination. The man didn't respond to Brad's protest. It was clear there was an urgent situation and there was no time to argue. As Brad stayed behind, Paige took a deep breath and followed the man. Paige was led into a large tent. Inside, a man lay on a stretcher in the center. His pale face and sweat-soaked forehead were clear signs of pain and a critical condition. A few armed men stood around him anxiously. One of them pointed to Paige as she entered and said, "We couldn't reach a doctor. This woman says she's a nurse." The man on the stretcher mumbled weakly, "Fine." Paige quickly approached the man and assessed the situation. At first glance, she noticed a severe issue with his leg. His pant leg was soaked in blood and the wound beneath looked deep. It didn't take long for Paige to realize he'd been shot. "I need some tools," she said firmly. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, one of the men hurriedly placed several first aid kits in front of her. As Paige opened the kits and selected the necessary supplies, the wounded man groaned in pain, losing more blood by the minute. Paige swiftly put on gloves and inspected the wound. The bullet had passed through, but the bleeding was severe, and the surrounding tissue was at high risk of infection. "The bullet's gone, but if I stitch this up now, it'll get infected and he could die," she said, her voice trembling slightly with concern. The men around her watched impatiently as Paige formulated a plan to control the bleeding. "Brad," she called out. Brad immediately entered the tent and listened to her instructions. "We need a tourniquet right here," she directed. Brad helped secure a tourniquet just above the wound. The bleeding slowed, but Paige knew this was only a temporary fix. The tourniquet bought them some time, but Paige needed to take another step. She grabbed a large bandage and began wrapping the wound to stabilize it. However, the moment she loosened the tourniquet, the bleeding resumed. The situation was becoming more critical by the second. Paige took a deep breath and looked around. Raising her head, she addressed the wounded man's companions. "He needs to go to a hospital. We're losing him," she warned. One of the men frowned and said coldly, "The police will show up. That's not an option. Do whatever you can." Paige's resolve didn't waver, but time was running out. The wounded man's breaths were growing weaker. One of the men shouted, "Don't let him die." Paige paused for a moment, then turned to Brad. "I need a knife," she said with determination. Brad hesitated for a moment before pulling a small pocket knife from his pocket and handing it to her. Paige had a bold yet dangerous plan in mind: cauterization. It was an old-fashioned method, but under these circumstances, it was the only option. Paige held the knife over the tent's central stove. As the blade's tip glowed red-hot, everyone in the tent watched her silently, trying to anticipate her next move. Only the injured man's groans echoed through the tense atmosphere. "Are you ready?" Brad whispered, his eyes fixed on Paige with concern. Paige took a deep breath. "It's his only chance," she said, her voice calm, though turmoil raged inside her. When the blade was hot enough, Paige knelt by the wounded man's leg. "Hold him tight," she instructed Brad. As Paige began the cauterization, the wounded man let out a blood-curdling scream. The sound was so raw and piercing that birds in the nearby forest scattered into the sky. The scream echoed through the tent, a vivid reminder of the pain and tension filling the air. When Paige finished, the man was barely conscious, but the bleeding had stopped. Wiping the sweat from her forehead, Paige took a deep breath and said, "He's stable for now." Her hands were still stained with blood, but her focus remained sharp. Raising her head, she addressed the men standing nearby. "Keep the wound clean and dry. I couldn't stitch it, but you need to prevent infection until proper help arrives. Be careful." Brad approached her, his expression tense and full of urgency. "We're leaving now," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Paige nodded, gathering her supplies. As they stepped out of the tent, walking briskly away, a sharp scream suddenly pierced the air. Paige froze, the sound hitting her like a bolt of lightning. A young man burst out of another tent and ran toward her, his face pale and filled with desperation. "Please help her," he pleaded. Paige hesitated for a moment, uncertainty flashing across her face. Brad stepped forward immediately. "No," he said firmly. "We've taken enough risks already. Paige, we can't do this." Paige turned to him, her eyes resolute. "I can't ignore this," she said softly but firmly. Brad sighed deeply, shaking his head in frustration. Yet he followed her without another word, knowing he couldn't stop her. Inside the tent, Paige found a heavily pregnant woman lying on a makeshift bed, exhausted and in visible pain. She was in labor. Paige knelt beside her, gently taking the woman's hand. "It's going to be okay," she said soothingly. "Just take deep breaths. I'm here to help you and your baby." As Paige moved to the other side of the tent to assess the situation, the man who had confronted them earlier stepped inside. His face was tense as he said coldly, "The boss says you need to leave. You can't stay here." Brad immediately stepped in, his voice firm and unyielding. "That baby needs her," he said, his eyes locked on the man's. "Do you really want to risk the lives of this woman and her child? Can you live with that?" The man hesitated, his expression hard but uncertain. After a long pause, he sighed and silently left the tent. Brad stood guard at the entrance, giving Paige the space she needed to focus. Paige turned to the women in the tent. "I need towels, hot water, and scissors," she instructed clearly. The women hurried out to fetch the items. As Paige carefully examined the pregnant woman, her face darkened. She muttered under her breath, "Damn it." The woman looked at her fearfully. "What's wrong? Is my baby okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Paige forced herself to remain calm and met the woman's gaze. "Your baby is breech," she explained gently but seriously. "This will make the delivery more difficult, but we'll get through it. Just listen to everything I say and stay calm. Breathe with me. You can do this." The woman nodded, her focus drawn to Paige's calm and reassuring voice. Paige gently helped her shift into a better position for the delivery while the woman's husband stayed by her side, offering quiet support. Soon the other women returned with the towels, hot water, and scissors Paige had requested. She prepared everything meticulously and began the delivery. When the baby's feet emerged first, Paige's expression grew even more serious. "All right, breathe and listen carefully. Push gently now," she instructed. The delivery was complicated, but Paige's expertise and determination kept the situation under control. Finally, the air was filled with the sound of a baby's cries. Paige smiled softly. "It's a boy," she announced. The mother, exhausted but overjoyed, cradled her newborn in her arms, her face glowing with relief. At the entrance, Brad stood frozen, captivated by what he had just witnessed. Paige's calm professionalism had brought hope and comfort to a place filled with fear and tension. But as Paige allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction, her expression faltered. The sight of the mother holding her baby triggered painful memories of her own loss. Her chest tightened as the weight of those memories pressed down on her, and tears began to fall silently. Brad noticed but chose not to interrupt, understanding the depth of her emotions. As Paige stood silently trying to compose herself, the tense entrance was pushed open. An unexpected figure stepped inside, the elderly Dr. Paige worked for. Paige and Brad stared in shock, unsure how he had found his way there. The doctor, however, looked entirely unbothered. "You need to leave this place immediately," he said firmly. Brad's frustration bubbled over. "What do you mean we need to leave? We've been through hell today. What's going on here?" he demanded. The doctor walked closer, his expression calm but resolute. "Brad, there's no time for this. I'll explain, but first we need to go," he replied. Brad didn't back down. "What are you even doing here? These people are criminals. This is dangerous." The doctor sighed deeply, sitting on a nearby rock. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll explain. They contacted me earlier today. I heard there was a wounded man, so I came right away," he began. Brad's anger deepened. "You know these people? This is an illegal operation. How can you?" The doctor cut him off with a tired shrug. "Yes, I know them. I come here once a week to help them. They need me." Paige frowned in confusion. "Why?" she asked softly. The doctor met her gaze. "This group is dangerous, I won't deny that. But not all of them are bad people. Many of them are just desperate, trapped in a life they didn't choose. They get sick, they get hurt, and yes, they have babies. If I don't help them, who will?" Brad ran a hand through his hair, his frustration clear. "It's reckless and dangerous," he muttered. The doctor nodded. "Yes, it is. But they're human beings, Brad. They deserve care like anyone else. If I don't step in, the consequences will be worse." As Paige listened, admiration for the doctor grew within her. Despite his age, he dedicated himself to serving even the most forgotten and feared people. She felt the gravity of his sacrifice and the immense courage it required. The doctor placed a hand on Paige's shoulder. "You've done remarkable work today. You saved that mother and her baby. That's no small thing." Paige nodded silently, her thoughts too heavy to voice. Brad, meanwhile, had fallen quiet. He was beginning to see both Paige and the doctor as lights in an often dark and dangerous world. After the long and tumultuous day, Paige and Brad returned to Iron Bar. The silence between them spoke volumes. Brad prepared 2 cups of coffee and placed them on the table, taking a deep breath. "The world can feel like a battlefield sometimes," he said quietly. "But today I realized something. It's not just about the fights. There's hope too. Like that baby." Paige lifted her head, Brad's words resonating deeply. "Everyone has their battles," she said softly. "But sometimes offering a helping hand can change everything." Brad smiled faintly. "You're not just a light in this town, Paige. You've been a light in my life too. You've reminded me that even in the darkest places, there's still hope." Paige smiled in return, his words easing the storm in her heart. The events of the day made her realize how much Iron River needed her, but more than that, they revealed a truth she had been searching for. Healing her own wounds could only come through helping others. Paige and Brad shared a quiet moment, understanding the weight of the doctor's secret. "Some lights are meant to shine in the shadows," Paige said softly, and Brad nodded. Together, they vowed to protect the doctor's work, a silent tribute to his courage. If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe for more heartfelt tales. See you next time.